Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Access Minnesota brings you the newsmakers and the stories that shape our everyday lives, with analysis from University of Minnesota faculty experts. Now, here's Jim Dubois.
Here we are in late November shooting this segment of Access Minnesota. It's 50 degrees and a heavy thunderstorm just rolled through the Twin Cities, leaving dime-size hail in some areas. On this edition of Access Minnesota, we sit down with Minnesota Department of Natural Resources senior climatologist Kenny Blumenfeld to talk about the unusual weather of 2016. Kenny Blumenfeld is senior climatologist at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. Kenny, welcome back to Access Minnesota.
It's always good to be on. Thanks, Jim.
If you live in Minnesota, no doubt you've noticed the above average fall temperatures we've been enjoying lately. But exactly how much warmer is Minnesota this fall compared to an average year?
That's a great question, and we've been trying to sort of untangle this ourselves. It depends on how you look at it and where you look at it, and the fall that we assess is really only 2/3 complete in terms of the data that we use, because it's September, October, and November. And the November statewide aggregated monthly data won't be in until the early part of December. And to keep things sort of simple, we can just look at September and October, and then kind of based on what we know is happening this November, we can make guesses. September and October together were on the warm end of the spectrum, kind of in the upper quarter of Minnesota fall. One of the things that was notable was that September was extremely wet, and we're really coming out of a very wet period. So what's been remarkable before this recent warming really took off was that not only were we running very warm, but we were running very wet, and that had sort of put us in a unique position in the kind of upper right-hand quadrant of a graph if you have temperature and precipitation. Now that we've added on about, well, as at this point, say 2 weeks of November, we are running way, way, way above normal for November in terms of temperatures. And it's going to put us probably, even with a cold air mass coming in, it's going to probably put us in the, upper 5 or 10 in terms of fall. Again, that's September, October, November, probably in the 5 warmest, maybe 10 warmest if we really get a cold blast in here. But that's records going back to 1895. So this is and we quite frankly could compete for the top spot.
Have the warmer temperatures this fall been seen all over the state, or are they confined to certain regions?
Oh, it's statewide. It's actually region-wide, and we often look at something like the Twin Cities because Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport, you can thread that record back with other locations in Minneapolis that go back to the 1870s. And so it's a very long and somewhat stable record. And so we often fixate on that. And of course, that's the center of population for so many people. But when we ignore Minneapolis-St. Paul, we're seeing all the same things. I mean, it's statewide, the coldest temperatures thus far have been among the warmest, and I mean the very warmest on record. So if you take the lowest temperature that's been observed in, whether it's Minneapolis or Waseca or Milan out in west central Minnesota or Duluth or Grand Rapids, the lowest temperature observed to date is the warmest such temperature on record, all those stations. So as we're recording this, a lot of these places haven't gone below 27, 28. Of course, the Twin Cities hasn't gone below freezing, and that's not ever been done at any of these stations. So this is a statewide, it's a region-wide, it's actually somewhat continental. We can look up in parts of central and northern Canada, and places are running 15, 20 degrees warmer than normal also.
In my garden, the tulips are pulling out of the soil again from the bulbs. A lot of people might think, hey, if we get a longer growing season, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. What are some of, though, of the potential consequences that might not be all that positive from a longer growing season?
Yeah, I mean, if the things that you want can grow, so can the things that you don't want. And we're really increasing the opportunity for things that are not normally here. And that's what we're doing. And I'm not an expert in impacts of climate change, but one of the things we talk about a lot are as we get warmer conditions, we're going to see a lot of secondary effects. In other words, the warmer fall is not going to injure you, and it's not going to harm you directly, but it is going to have an impact on some of our commerce and some of our ability to do business because, people who are growing things are going to have more competition from things that they're not trying to grow. Invasive crops would be just one example. And so a long growing season equals more opportunity for things that you both do want here and also things that you don't want here.
How did rainfall combined with the warmer temperatures affect the fall climate this season?
It was absurd. I mean, this is one of the, November so far has really dried out in Minnesota, but the September through mid-October period was off the charts, just ridiculously wet. And we had, all-time record rainfall at some stations during September on both a monthly standpoint and also daily. And our station at Waseca, which is a long-standing station, is gunning for the wettest year on record for the entire state. Now, it might not make it, but it's up there, it's a contender.
Well, the temperatures are not only warmer during the day, but our nightly low temperatures are actually trending higher. What impact does that have?
Well, that makes it harder for things to cool down. I mean, I guess we could talk about the benefits that we often forget. It's gonna make your heating bills smaller. But in the summertime and in the fall on a really warm evening, it's going to make it so that you have to run your AC more. And in the summertime, we know that this year, the Twin Cities just absolutely obliterated its old record of number of nights where the low temperature did not fall below 60 degrees. We had over 100 such nights. And the previous record had been 91. So we really blew this record away. And when we look at other stations, we see similar things, although maybe at a lower temperature threshold. And what that means is that it takes more work to get cool in the warm season. Again, it might not affect you adversely when it's really cold, but some of the consequences are that it's going to be harder to cool down when it's warm, and then also in the wintertime, higher low temperatures are going to connote a tendency to allow more things into the region that couldn't normally exist here.
Just how much are Minnesota's autumns and other seasons warming? Next on Access Minnesota, we continue our conversation with Department of Natural Resources Senior Climatologist Kenny Blumenfeld.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
Now back to our conversation about our unusual weather with Minnesota Department of Natural Resources Senior Climatologist Kenny Blumenfeld. Why do you think we're seeing fall warming at a faster rate than other seasons of the year here?
Well, so the fastest warming that we're seeing is in winter. All our seasons in Minnesota are warming, and winter is warming the fastest. Summer and spring are lagging behind a bit, but they are both warming. But when we compare winter to summer, we see a warming that's about 10 times faster. That's averaged around the state. It's actually a faster rate in northern Minnesota and a slightly slower rate in southern Minnesota, but there's rapid warming in the winter. And in fall, we see about 7 times more warming in recent decades than we're seeing in the summer. One of the reasons, I mean, there's a lot going on here. It's a complicated, lots of interactions. But the way that the greenhouse effect works is it really prevents heat from escaping. It's adding an extra layer of heat trapping molecules into the air. And we lose heat the fastest in winter, and we begin really losing that heat, as you imagine the days getting shorter rapidly in the fall. And so basically when we're supposed to be cooling off because we're getting less sunlight, those extra greenhouse gases that we now have in the atmosphere are keeping us a little bit warmer. They're basically preventing us from cooling off. That's having the effect of sort of extending our growing season or extending our warm season a bit. So even if we don't get the sultry heat of summer, when you really see the temperatures nosediving in the fall, we're not actually seeing that right now.
Do you have any feel at this point for how winter will look in Minnesota this coming year?
Well, that's such a good question, and everybody wishes they had an answer for it. You know, the professional forecasters who specialize in long-range forecasting, they look at the Pacific Ocean, and they look at a few other things. They look at these sort of oscillations in the atmosphere. And they see a La Nina condition in the Pacific Ocean near the equator, which means that it's sort of the opposite of El Nino, which has warmer than normal equatorial Pacific Ocean waters. The La Nina has colder than normal equatorial Pacific waters. And that historically has spelled somewhat cooler conditions in the wintertime here, but we don't have a good physical mechanism that actually links those cold ocean waters to cold winters. We just say, oh, well, the X number of times that we've had a La Nina type condition, we've ended up with a cold winter. When we look a little more closely, let's say we look at the autumn years that have been really, really warm. So let's look at our top 20. When we look at our 20 warmest September, October, November periods, we see that about 70% of the time, they're followed by a really warm winter. So when we look at the link between the Pacific Ocean and our weather, that suggests a cold winter. When we look at just the fact that we've had a really warm fall already, we are very likely, almost guaranteed to end up in the top 20, really the top 10 for autumns on record. And having that warm of a fall tends to be followed by not just a warmer than normal winter, but a much warmer than normal winter. So, if anybody watching this can accept that I'm not a professional seasonal forecaster, I think I would tend to believe that this winter will be warm and not maybe the cold and dreadful winter that some have been forecasting. It's just right now, we get our cold air from Canada, especially northern Canada. And right now those places are running 15 to 20 degrees warmer than normal. You actually have to go across the Arctic Ocean into Siberia before you can get cold, really cold conditions where it looks and feels a lot like winter right now. And they're having fairly severe conditions, but we have to get that Siberian air down to us before we can really start talking about winter-like, really deep winter-like conditions. And especially if you want to have a colder than normal or a colder than average winter, you need a steady feed of that deeply cold Siberian air, and you need it to not get modified on its way over as it passes over the Canadian landscape. And right now there's just no mechanism to allow that to happen.
Well, given the warmer temperatures and the rapidly warming fall seasons, what kind of adjustments do you think we will need to make to acclimate ourselves to this evolving weather pattern?
Well, I mean, if we're just looking at the warming conditions, I think that we're having pretty pronounced regional warming here. I think everybody that I've spoken with, and I've gone across the state and spoken with a lot of different people, I think everyone recognizes that winters are getting warmer and people are noticing a change in the character of the growing season. And I think that when you're talking about the kind of warming that we've observed and a continuation plus a intensification of that kind of warming, I think that has real consequences for what we do in wintertime. I mean, we've had an increase in the number of years recently where we haven't had what we think of as winter, where the ice fishing has been late or bad or, erratic at best, where the snow recreation has been confined to either a small part of northeastern Minnesota or has been extra costly for the resorts because they have to produce their own snow and don't rely on as much being provided by the weather. And in some cases, they just have situations and conditions that they can't even operate. I think we have to start to accept that the kinds of changes that we have seen, the kinds of anomalies that we have seen over the last few decades are becoming more and more the norm, and the kinds of things that we used to expect from winter are becoming a lot less dependable. That, to me, is the biggest thing we need to accept. And then the ramifications of that shortened winter on the things that grow here. I think that's a really powerful one because we don't get as cold as we used to get. And so we already know that, for example, the larch beetle, the eastern larch beetle, has been observed to have an additional generation during the year. And it preys on some of our trees, especially the tamaracks that we have. And so some of the tamaracks in central and especially northern Minnesota are distressed because one of their predators essentially is wiping them out. And so from a management standpoint, it's clear that we need to accept really accept that the changes we're observing are not just anomalies, but are actually part of the pattern, part of what we should expect more of, and we need to really adjust our practices to suit those observations.
Climate change is a politically charged term. When Access Minnesota returns, we'll talk with Minnesota Department of Natural Resources senior climatologist Kenny Blumenfeld on why he prefers to avoid using the term climate change.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages. You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
And now, more of our conversation with Minnesota Department of Natural Resources senior climatologist Kenny Blumenfeld about our unusual weather. We've seen warming temperatures, but along with the warmer temperatures, are we also seeing more weather extremes, extreme precipitation events, for example?
Well, we are definitely seeing an increase in the frequency and the severity of our big rainfall events. That's something that I think we can hang our hats on in Minnesota, in the upper Midwest, and really in much of the U.S. I think we often approach the problem, people often approach it incorrectly in the media. It is not probably constructive to just look at all the places that have been hit by 100-year storms, because the way that the supposed 100-year rainfall works is it's really calculated for a specific place. And when you have a large landmass like the United States, it doesn't make sense to just say, okay, well, City A had a 100-year rainfall, and so did City B 75 or 500 miles away, and so therefore they're part of the same problem. But what we do see is when we look at the kinds of stations that have really long-term records that we can push back far enough, we see if we just count the number of rainfall events that are above a certain amount, say above 1 inch, we see that those numbers are going up each year. Or not necessarily year over year, but they're going up over time. And so it's a yearly average increase in the number of, say, 1 inch, 2 inch, and 3 inch rainfalls. And then if we also look at things like the largest rainfall of the year, that number or the size of that rainfall event is also increasing. And this does point to, we are getting bigger rainfall events that tend to take up more time, more space, and they're leaving a bigger impact.
During the recent presidential campaign, there wasn't a great deal of discussion about climate issues. For some people, climate and the notion of a changing climate is a highly charged political issue. If we can agree that the data doesn't lie, the data is presenting things as they are, is there a way to depoliticize the issue, to take politics out and deal with the data and let people discuss whether or not it's primarily driven by human activities, whether it's part of some sort of natural cycle, and get to the real work of trying to do something about it?
Well, that's a big question you just asked. Yes, I mean, there's so many different pieces of this. I think that well, for one, I mean, the work that we do, and when I go and do outreach, it can't be political, because we're going to lose half or maybe even most of our audience right away. So what I try to do, and it's worked well for me, is just drop some of the jargon that throws people off in the first place. To me, the term climate change is really, it's not particularly useful. It actually doesn't tell you what's happening. It actually doesn't tell you the problems that you're facing. It's just the sort of term, the title for this series of symptoms that we're trying to deal with. And when, at least at a local and at a state level, I've found it's really helpful to just talk about the symptoms, because if you point to a chart that's easy to read and it shows pretty decisively that the winters in the area that you're presenting are less severe, and they're becoming less severe, and they're becoming shorter, and the growing seasons are becoming longer, people can usually relate to that. And they go, oh, I've seen that. And you didn't tell them, you didn't in that way sort of alienate them with a term that maybe means more to them than you'd like. So for me, we all care about where we live, and we all care about the resources of our state. And I do believe that most people want to be good stewards of that, and they also want to see a viable future. And so I think when we keep it in that kind of language, and we can agree that, well, this is what we're observing. There is a deeper question of, well, why are we observing that? But a lot of times people don't really necessarily need to know that when they're just trying to adapt to changes. But if someone asks, why is this happening? I'll let them know. We're seeing global rises in temperature, and these are changing the weather patterns, and it's resulting in the sorts of changes that we're seeing here. But that's a deeper question that doesn't always need to be addressed, and it certainly doesn't need to be addressed right off the bat. So to me, not using terms that are already somewhat taboo and already have political meaning, I think that's been pretty helpful in my experience. I can't guarantee that it would work for everyone, and I certainly can't guarantee that it works in every situation. But that's something we could all at least, experiment with. Try not using the word and say instead what the real issue is. And then in terms of what didn't come up during the debates, there's been some research at Yale on the sociology, basically in our country, of sort of our changing climate. And we know from that research and other research that the environment was already pretty low on most people's priority list. People want financial security. They want to know that they can pay the bills. They often think about the things that are, immediately important to them. And the environment becomes abstract, and climate as a sub-part of the environment, and one where there's so much, political back and forth and so much political disagreement, it just ends up being sort of a naturally low priority. And I understand why politicians who are trying to curry the favor of voters would want to avoid it, because they know that if I bring this up, I might be true to my platform or my beliefs, but I'm going to lose a bunch of people. So in that way, it's not surprising that we didn't hear much about it. It's a little disappointing, and I think that there are ways of talking about what's happening without asking a politician point blank, do you believe in or do you accept climate change? I think there are other ways of actually getting them to tell you what they would do to pursue environmental initiatives.
Kenny Blumenfeld is Senior Climatologist at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. Kenny, thanks for joining us again on Access Minnesota.
It's always good. Thanks a lot, Jim.
That's all for this month's edition of Access Minnesota. We'll see you again next month. Thanks for watching.
Access Minnesota. Issues that matter to you. Join us again next week as we bring you the newsmakers and stories that shape our everyday lives. Access Minnesota is produced by the Minnesota Broadcasters Association in cooperation with the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts.